RIN TV coverage of the 2013 RIMS conference is brought to you by the Hawaii Captive Insurance Council.
During the RIMS conference, we had a chance to speak with Turner and MaryAnn Susavidge from the Environmental Product Recall Unit at Excel. And here's what they had to say.
I expect that while we're at RIMS, we're going to hear a lot about reputational risk. For us, that's certainly important when you look at the environmental side of everybody's business. And we look at crisis management and disaster response and really what that means to somebody's risk in terms of how they address issues that they face. For us, we expect on the environmental side that we'll see quite a bit in the food and beverage industry, and so we decided to take on an initiative to address that sector. And as we looked at it, we realized that within the company we had a lot of other experience on the product recall side, and so we've put together a combined product to address the food and beverage industry's issues.
What we're seeing is that companies are looking for a better solution from insurers. So the things with reputational issues is that you can buy all the insurance coverage in the world, but at the end of the day, if you've damaged your reputation, it doesn't really count for very much. In relation to food-related contamination events, what we're seeing is an increase in the number of events, and we're seeing an increase in the severity of those events. For instance, in the fourth quarter of 2012, which is the last available data that we have at the moment, it was the busiest quarter for food-related product recalls in the last 2 years. We had 552 recall events for the FDA alone.
When you look at food contamination, for us it's primarily around disinfection of the equipment used in their processes. And even at establishments such as restaurants, if you have contamination, you need to deal with the disinfection. And so that's really where our product comes into play, where food is contaminated as well as the processes related to the food. Typical
reasons for contamination events are things like pathogens, which is E. coli, salmonella, strains of bacteria which are harmful to humans. Allergens is a huge driver at the moment. There's a lot of allergen-related recalls at the moment. It's the biggest single driver of recalls in Canada, and also I think it's the second largest driver of recalls in the US. So those are a couple of the issues. A lot of them, however, come from supply chain related issues. Companies are very confident quite often what they do within their four walls, but the supply chain they're exposed to means that no matter how good they are within those four walls, if there's a weak chain in their supply chain, that's going to show up.
So beyond the contamination of the product itself, they may also have other environmental issues at those locations which could impact their business and interrupt the chain.
It's the contamination issue. Can that cause a recall? So what we're trying to do at Excel is to provide a solution for food industry risks. So in that regard, a contamination event can obviously cause a pollution issue at a food facility, but it can also cause a contamination of product. So what we're seeking to do is to marry the coverages together to provide a seamless solution for food and drink industry companies today.
And I think we really have a combination of two things, the requirements of the FDA, and then when you add the environmental impact, you have the EPA driving regulations. So we have both of those, as well as local agencies such as health departments driving what a insured needs to address in a contamination event.
I think there's a lot of steps that can be taken. Speaking from a product contamination standpoint, the same issues will apply for environmental insurance, but we're really, we're seeing a lot of companies move towards GFSI certification. I mean, for instance, Excel, we were involved in a BRC, Food Safety Americas conference a couple of weeks ago, and BRC are one of the larger bodies that certify to what we call GFSI standards. So it's a global food safety standard that is throughout the world. So that's one thing, they can seek to have certification, which means that they've got a very high bar to reach to achieve that certification. And if they do that, then they're improving their risk. But again, I don't think we can emphasize enough supply chain, because we're still talking about what is done within the four walls by a food company. They're normally very confident about that, but again, supply chain. What is happening in your global supply chain 365, 24/7?
And from the environmental perspective, obviously they have to have permits in place, so you have issues with wastewater as well as possibly ammonia and the storage of that. And so are they really following the regulations, their permits, the plans that they have in place for their risk management?
On the product contamination side, we have a combined product And what we provide there is coverage for accidental contaminations, which will cover a typical glass contamination or a metal contamination or a pathogen contamination, but also mislabeling issues. So we're picking up those allergen risks as well. We also cover malicious contaminations. Don't happen too often, but when they do, it's critical to have something that can respond both from an insurance coverage perspective, but particularly a crisis management perspective. It's really important that companies' reputation is protected and they take the right steps from day one and have the access to the right resources to be able to mitigate those risks to the business.
On environmental, the coverages for the food and beverage include disinfecting the equipment, as well as the disaster response, having people come to their aid to protect their reputation. Beyond that, there's the broader environmental protections for their wastewater handling if they have an accidental discharge or an accidental release from ammonia or any real other issue that may exist at the facility.
Very important piece of legislation was launched in January of 2011, the Food Safety Modernisation Act, which is the biggest change in food regulation in the US since 1938. So what's happened is the regulatory bar has been raised in a similar way in which we saw across the European Union some 10 or so years ago. And what we saw in relation to that was the numbers of contamination events and recalls increased because the regulatory bar has been raised. Everybody's got to get their game together to get up to that regulatory level. And what we expect to see is a spike in the number of recall events between that lag from companies raising themselves up to the new regulatory standard.
We'd like to thank the sponsors of RIN TV's coverage of the 2013 RIMS conference in Los Angeles.